Welcome to the last video, part 5, in Learning Aim B, Cybersecurity. Today we're going to focus on the policies, backups and data recovery. We have 4 objectives for this video. The first one is for us to be able to define who is responsible for cybersecurity policies and how concerns can be reported to line managers. We're then going to look at security parameters, including password policies, which we've looked at in previous videos. We're going to understand the requirements of a disaster recovery policy, including how we do backups and how we can recover data from these backups. And lastly, we're going to look at the actions to take after an attack to our systems. For a quick sharp starter, have a think about the following scenario. A company has been infected with ransomware and they've been asked to pay around £250 to receive the encryption password for each computer to get their files back. How could the organisation recover the data without having to pay this fee? And who is responsible for solving this problem? Hopefully, the organisation had a backup of their files. This means they can delete the original files that are encrypted and don't have to pay the ransom fee and can just reinstall the backup data so they can work on this as it was. IT technicians should be looking for backups and installing those backups alongside dealing with any malware. So if ransomware was to come through, the IT technician should spot this and remove it before it causes any harm. We're going to be looking at this later on. Leading from the previous question, when we think about responsibilities, there are a number of different people in a business who are responsible for keeping the computer secure. The technicians we mentioned earlier look at malware and try and remove this from the system to keep the system safe, but IT directors and managers are also responsible for writing and enforcing IT policies. These policies make sure that employees keep doing the rules that are followed to keep the system safe. We're going to have a look at employees' responsibilities on the next slide. When employees are working for a business, they need to make sure they follow the policies that we'll look at in the later slides. If an employee has a problem or believes that somebody is not doing what they should be doing according to the policies, then there should be a procedure to report this. This is called whistleblowing. It's where they let their line manager or people who are in charge know of a problem that is occurring so it can be solved. There may be many policies that are used by organisations. A policy is set guidelines of what you can and cannot do. We have some of these at our school. The first one we're going to look at is the acceptable use policy. And then we'll have a look at password policies. In an acceptable use policy, it explains how employees should act when using the IT systems. You have this when you're using the computers in school. If you did not follow the acceptable use policy, for example downloaded some games onto the systems, then you could be sanctioned accordingly. Employees may have to follow certain rules when using IT, such as making sure computers are locked or logged off when they are not being used. They may need to make sure they're only using the internet for office use and not personal use, such as checking social media. Same as emails. They may not email their family or friends and make sure that they're using the work emailer site for only work conversations. And they may not be able to bring in their personal devices, such as smartphones. This may cause distractions when they should be working. If they were to break any of these rules, they would then be breaking the acceptable use policy and they could be sanctioned accordingly by their line manager. This may be a warning or a dismissal. A warning could be in written, or it could be a verbal communication warning, or a dismissal is where you're removed from the job. In an acceptable use policy, it will also cover what software you can use and if you can install your own software. You may want to install iTunes so you can play your own personal music while you are working. And if this is against the acceptable use policy, then you should know that you're not allowed to do this, so you're not sanctioned when you do. Another policy could be a password policy. We've had a look at what made a strong password in the previous videos. But organisations may have written policies explain to their employees what they should do when creating passwords. This will ensure the password is strong in strength to keep the data protected. If employees don't follow this password policy, they may then be dismissed or again given a written or verbal warning. If a disaster was to strike your organisation, such as a flood, fire or power cut, it's important that data is protected, and any data that is lost, staff can have responsibilities on restoring it, such as technicians could restore backups, or employees could make sure that their systems are secure and up to date. The media and public team could let customers know if any information has been taken so they can check to make sure they are safe in terms of their bank account details. Staff need to be aware of what they can and cannot do when a disaster occurs, such as who does what and when. A backup also needs to be in place to make sure that if any data is lost, then they can recover the data from the backup. We'll have a look at backups in more detail now. Many of you will see the server room as you walk past the classrooms in school. This server stores all the files that people use on the different computers in school. Most servers will have two hard disks to store the identical data. Therefore, if one breaks, it can instantly be removed and replaced and use the second one for the data files so they still remain. Some companies decide that only having two copies on a server is not secure enough, and therefore they make regular backups and store them off-site. A lot of companies are now using cloud technology to store their backups online. This brings many advantages and disadvantages that we could talk about in future videos. When completing a backup, you have many different options for your media to use. Some people use a USB, but you may use a magnetic tape if you have a larger storage capacity requirement. When you take a backup also depends on how many files you may update. If you update on a daily basis, then if you also lose the files, then you can reinstall the yesterday's file backup and therefore you will not have lost that much data. If, however, you back up on a weekly basis and you are halfway through the week and you lose the files, you may not then be able to reinstall them because your backup is not recent enough. We also have an incremental backup, and this is where you only update changes that have been made. Backups are normally stored at a different location. This could also be in a fireproof safe. Therefore, if there was a power cut in your location that you are working in, your backup in another location will still be accessible. When you are recovering data from a backup, this can cause problems for your staff and customers. The first problem could be a timeline for the data recovery. When you are installing the backup to recover the files, the time that it takes will mean that your systems could be down. This means your staff will not be able to work on them and customers may not be able to place any orders. When you are waiting for data to be restored, you may have alternative provisions, such as a paper system being used, where you look at paper notes to find out what to do while the backup is being recovered. You may also purchase alternative computers while your computers that you normally use are being used for the data recovery. We're now going to take a look at the key 5 actions that organizations should take after they've had an attack on their system. It starts off with their investigation, then it goes to them responding to the problem or the attack. They then need to manage to make sure they can carry on doing some part of their daily routines. They need to recover the files that they may have lost. And finally, they need to analyze what went wrong so they can make sure it doesn't happen again in the future. We're going to look at each of the 5 stages in more detail now. When your system has been attacked, the first thing you need to do is investigate. In this investigation, you will identify what happened, when did it happen, and how did it happen. You may identify that some malware has got onto your computer, such as a virus. Once you've identified the type of attack, you can then identify how severe it was. Did the virus come onto your system and then be removed within a matter of minutes by your antivirus software? Or is it of a severe case where the virus has got on and has damaged all your files? You need to identify what hardware has been affected. Can you continue to use the hardware with your employees, or do you need to look at a plan to get alternative hardware into place? And lastly, you need to investigate has there been any data lost in the attack that you need to report to the GDPR. This means then you will not be prosecuted by law in the future. After your investigation is complete, the second stage is to respond. In this stage, you will communicate with all the people who have been affected, such as your staff and your customers. You may also need to communicate with the government if there's a breach that has affected national security. If our school was to be attacked by a cyber attack, we would need to inform people like parents and guardians, students and staff, and we may need to communicate with the government or local councils if there's key data that has been stolen. By responding and letting people know what has happened, you are then giving them an opportunity to make sure that they are safe. If, for example, bank details have been stolen, by responding to customers, they can then check their bank statements to ensure that they are protected in the future. The third stage is to manage the problem or the attack. To solve the attack, we contain it by looking at what's been affected and keeping that part cornered off. If, for example, the school was attacked in a cyber attack that harmed the computers in CG1, we would then zone that room off, and any lesson that was to take place in that room would move to CG2 or CG3. This gives us time then to fix the problems in CG1 while also allowing people to carry on working in CG2 and CG3, so we are managing the problem to find a solution that allows us to keep working. Disaster recovery procedures may need to be applied. Again, what you have planned to do in a disaster should then be carried out to make sure that you recover. This leads us to the fourth stage in recovering the data. A disaster recovery plan that is implemented will say how you conduct any backups. So where do you get the backup from? Who installs the backup? This information is then followed to get you your files back that you have lost in your cyber attack. The organisation will now be vulnerable to the same attack in the future. Therefore, this leads to the final stage where you can do analysis and identify how you can prevent this attack happening again in the future. We'll look at this stage now. Once an organisation has conducted stage 1 to 4 after a cyber attack, they're then in that final stage where they complete analysis. In this stage, they identify what's happened, what can they put in place to prevent the attack happening again in the future, should there be any new policies to make sure that staff follow something that should keep the data safe in the future, and also, can they do any penetration testing, which we looked at in our previous video, to improve the strength and security of their system that they use. By performing this analysis, they should be able to identify any possible solutions, such as training or purchasing more security equipment to make sure that attacks cannot happen again and their data is more secure.